They became part of the big four of doom metal. From sharing stages with the likes of Motorhead, Venom, and even black metal legend Sabbath from Japan, to scoring US Billboard chart positions. Their debut album, Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, would not only spawn an entirely unique genre called epic doom metal, the record also became iconic in its own right. They even had a music video produced by Jonas Åkerlund, formerly a member of legendary Swedish outfit Bathory. This is Demon's Gate, the story of Candlemass.
Some of our albums has been known to be quite depressive, but like Nightfall was mostly around death.
Considering Candlemass released one of the most influential debut records in heavy metal history, they also disappeared into the abyss before anyone even knew who they were. Not only did they not really have a singer in the beginning, they even got dropped from their record label shortly after the LP was released. So how did these Scandinavian pioneers of doom metal go from being kicked off a small French record label to becoming legends within heavy metal? Well, it all started in Sweden with Leif Edling. Leif Edling would be the founding member of Candlemass around 1984 after his previous band Nemesis simply didn't go anywhere. However, they did release one 12-inch in 1984 called The Day of Retribution. This record is officially labeled as heavy metal and doom metal, and as you might have guessed, was influenced by Black Sabbath. Of course it was. I got paranoid from my parents when I was 8 or 9 years old. It had a massive effect on me, of course. So many great albums came out in those days. I started to buy my own records around 73, 74. Sparks, BTO, Heap, Sabbath, Deep Purple. I have also been very influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal. So I'm not totally Sabbath blind. I got paranoid from my mother back in 71 or 72, and I still think it's the best music ever created. We obviously expected to see Sabbath here as an influence, but not Sparks. Sparks are an American rock pop synth group formed back in 1971. They released several records in the 70s with their debut Half Nelson in 1972, A Woofer in Tweeter's Clothing in 1973, and Kimono My House in 1974. And whilst I can't imagine anyone is going to know any of these albums, there is for sure one song here absolutely everyone probably would have heard at some point in their life. And then BTO, which stands for Bachman Turner Overdrive, another pretty iconic rock band from the 70s. And it's no surprise to see Black Sabbath here. Their debut album, released in 1970, is even classed as a doom metal record, technically making it the first doom metal record to ever be released, although many will disagree with this modern definition. Regardless, I think it's safe to say that if it wasn't for Black Sabbath, doom metal probably wouldn't have ever been a thing in the first place, or heavy metal in general. I think that we can all agree on. And of course, we have the new wave of British heavy metal with the likes of Saxon, Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, and Raven, to name a few, influencing the entire development of heavy metal music throughout the 70s. Another group that was part of this movement but rarely gets mentioned would be Angel Witch, and their debut would be another great inspiration for the development of Candlemass. For example, with that first Angel Witch album, I truly admired Kevin Hayborn because of what he did back in 79 and 1980. The first Angel Witch album is one of the best albums ever recorded, I think. And when I met Kevin Hayborn in London, he said, "Oh, Candlemass, my favorite band. I mean, that's brilliant." The club for mutual admiration. Angel Witch's debut studio album was released in 1980 and released via Bronze Records, the same label that put out Motorhead's Ace of Spades. And I have to say, every Angel Witch album released in the 80s is pretty epic, and always bemused me as to why they didn't see way more success than they did. And like many bands from Sweden and across Europe in general, Candlemass chose to sing in English in order to reach a wider audience. Well, that and Leif thought it would sound ridiculous in Swedish. All metal bands sing in English. We've got no metal bands singing in Swedish. There are none. It doesn't exist. Metal in Swedish sounds so stupid. I have friends that had a band and they sang in Swedish just for the fun of it, because it sounded so stupid, and they were quite popular because they sang in Swedish, because people just laughed at them. They became popular like a comedy act. This was and is a natural path for many rock and heavy metal groups where English isn't their native tongue. A mix of being influenced by British and American groups and knowing that you have more chance of going global if you sing in English. There are exceptions, of course. Candlemass would record their first demo in 1984 called Witchcraft, followed by a second demo called The Garage, as it was literally recorded in a studio called The Garage. This purely to get a record deal. I sent the demo to about 10 labels. I know that I gave one to Brian Ross, who was the singer in an English band called Satan. He was planning to start his own record company, but nothing came of it. We were keen on Black Dragon because we loved some of the other bands they'd signed, like Manila Road and Chastain. So when they offered us a deal, we were delighted. Manila Road were a heavy metal group from Kansas, USA, and Chastain, although never actually released a record via Black Dragon, were also another heavy metal group from the United States, but gives you an idea of what Leif Edling was into at the time of recording the debut Candlemass album. So here's what they sound like, and a couple of other groups that were on the Black Dragon label at the time. Black Dragon would be the French label that signed Candlemass to put out their debut record and gave them an impressively awful budget of around $1,800 to do so. Candlemass would also bring in their first official singer, albeit temporary. Black Dragon wanted me to carry on singing. They liked what I'd done on the demo, but I wasn't at all comfortable, and my aim was to get in someone permanent. Mats knew a guy called Johan Lengqvist, who'd been in various bands around Stockholm, such as Johan Quiz, and he agreed to do the album. I was convinced that once we got hold of Johan, then he'd agree to join full-time, but I was wrong. As soon as we'd finished in the studio, he was off again. Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus, the debut studio album by Candlemass, would be released in June of 1986, and would sell such a small number of copies that Black Dragon dropped the band almost immediately. And the album itself was seemingly not even fun to record. We wanted to work there because we'd heard a demo that 𝤣Ge Malmsteen had done at the studio, and it sounded amazing, but little did we know the conditions we were going to face. It was absolutely freezing in there, and if ever a band suffered for their doomcraft, then it was this lot. You have no idea how cold it was, totally freezing. The radiators didn't work, which made it even worse. You had to see what we looked like. We were all dressed in fur coats, woolen gloves and long johns. Trying to play guitar with cold hands is almost impossible. I know we're a doom band, but this was suffering way beyond the call of duty. And trust me, as someone that has lived in Sweden and spent many cold nights in Stockholm, it gets really, really cold. But you can always rely on some nice cheap alcohol to warm you up, which is exactly what Candlemass did. We knew we had so little time in the studio that there was none to waste. We had to get on with the job, and partying wasn't on the agenda. Actually, focusing on the recording process wasn't all that difficult. All of us were used to being in the studio, so we could concentrate. But vodka might have made a difference. So considering Epicus Doomicus Metallicus is considered to be one of the greatest metal records ever released, why on earth did it flop when it was released? And it certainly didn't bring Candlemass any immediate success. Quite the opposite. But it seemed being dropped from Black Dragon was kind of a blessing in disguise. We were hammered everywhere. Sure, some of the very small fanzines loved what we were doing, but the bigger magazines just slammed us. They didn't get what was being done at all. However, in the long term, all of that worked in our favor. In the end, the failure of the album to sell immediately was such a boost. You see, firstly, Black Dragon dropped the band, which allowed us to sign a new deal with Active Records. Then the metal underground began to discover the album without any media promoting or hype, so things just started to mushroom and explode all on their own. So essentially, it seemed that this album was what you could call a slow burner, in that it simply took a bit of time to find the right audience. And the funny thing is, Black Dragon told Candlemass that they wouldn't be paid any royalties at all due to how poorly the record sold. Instead, Candlemass received 2 international reply coupons. These were coupons you could use to buy postage stamps with, and they were worth about $1. When the album started to take off on Active Records, Black Dragon sure were kicking themselves. Nevertheless, Candlemass, despite a very rough start, were kind of on the right path, but now they needed to find a new singer. Enter Messiah Marcolin. In 1982, a Swedish heavy metal group called Mercy would release their first EP called Swedish Metal. Can you guess what it sounds like? Yeah, no points for a creative title there. And following this in 1984, released their first self-titled debut studio album via Fingerprint Records in Sweden. Now, interestingly, Fingerprint Records is the same Swedish label that released the Nemesis EP, The Day of Retribution, the group that would become Candlemass. Although Fingerprint Records only lasted a couple of years, they put out some pretty impressive records for this era. Messiah Marcolin didn't appear on the first EP, but was the vocalist for the 2 studio albums, and is actually credited as the drummer on Witchburner. Witchburner is an interesting record. It for sure has a massive Black Sabbath influence and some interesting titles such as I'm Your Pervert Priest, Welcome to My Graveyard, and Voodoo Kills. But I can't help but feel that Messiah's vocals are kind of held back by the music itself. If you listen to the way I used to sing with Mercy and the way I sing for Candlemass, they are 2 opposite things, really. I was indeed very influenced by Johan's singing, even though I never met him in person. When I was doing the audition for the position of the singer, I remember trying to sound exactly like him. I think that he did a great job on that album. He did a great job, but I think that he was a pop singer, and he was not really interested in this kind of music at all. I know that I was there when Candlemass did their first ever show. Messiah would first feature on the second Candlemass record, Nightfall, released in 1987. The artwork itself is one of 4 paintings by an American artist by the name of Thomas Cole, painted in 1840. Childhood, youth, manhood, and old age would be the title of each painting in this series. The painting Candlemass used for Nightfall, which was Old Age, was the final painting in the series and is said to be an image of death. The man on the boat seemingly at the end of his life being guided to heaven by an angel. Many consider Nightfall to be the band's breakthrough record, although difficult to really confirm this through things such as sales figures, as these types of statistics have all but disappeared. We do, however, have an epic music video from this record. 𝕣Get was directed by Jonas Åkerlund, formerly of Bathory. Gives us an interesting look into the world of Candlemass at the time, and this video is also said to feature Dead of Mayhem. Can you spot him? One thing we do know is that the album not only saw a release in Europe, but also the USA, Greece, and South Korea. I mean, obviously, everyone knows doom metal was big in South Korea, right? The US version was released through Metal Blade Records, and if you know anything about metal, you'll know Metal Blade Records. And this was a time when record labels took more of a risk in terms of what they released, and honestly, if it wasn't for this attitude, metal would have completely died a long time ago. The whole scene there was one big scene, and we were all kind of working together to try and make it big. Even bands like Motley Crue and Rat that were part of what we were doing. Obviously, Rat was on the first Metal Massacre, and Motley Crue, I helped them get together with a distributor for the Too Fast for Love album. Everybody was just excited to try and make something happen back then because it was very new and super underground, and the major labels couldn't care less. And this is a million years before computers or cell phones or any of those things, so anything you can do to make something happen, even putting out a record and being on a record in 1982, was a huge thing for anybody. Metal Blade released Slayer's debut record in 1983 and Trouble's debut record in 1984. Trouble would come to be known as part of the Big Four of doom metal, along with Pentagram, St. Vitus, and of course Candlemass. And this brings us to an interesting point in history overall for metal music, and specifically doom metal music. As we already know, Candlemass released their debut in 1986, but doom metal was already spreading ominous sounding music to the masses. In 1984, Trouble and St. Vitus both released their debut records, and a year later, Pentagram released their first album. All three of these bands, including Candlemass, would come to be known as the Big Four of Doom. However, we also have another group that preceded all of these, Witchfinder General. Formed in the UK in 1979, they would release their debut studio album, Death Penalty, in 1982, and their second studio record, Friends of Hell, in 1983, both of which are classed as doom metal records. Another group called Pagan Altar released a demo cassette that was also labeled as doom metal, and then a year later, another group, The Obsessed, released an EP. Neither of these groups released an album in the 80s, but still an important mention for this time period and genre overall. So whilst doom metal was already kicking up a storm before Candlemass, they quite naturally became part of this movement, and some even refer to Candlemass as epic doom metal, due to the title of their first record and the overall sound of it. We'd always called our music epic doom metal, right? That's the way we believed our sound should be represented. And then Mats Ekström gave it that Latin feel with Epicus Doomicus Metallicus. But when he put that forward as a possible album title, I was horrified. It was just utter shite. Come on, have you ever heard anything worse? The trouble was that there was no obvious alternative. I'm sure we did come up with others, but they must have been so dreadful that I blocked them from my mind. Perhaps in choosing something so preposterous, we actually laid the foundations for our own success. But it didn't seem so at the time. Candlemass had definitely joined the ranks of doom metal pioneers already by this stage with their debut Epicus Doomicus Metallicus in 1986, and things were starting to gain some traction, especially with the release of Nightfall. Candlemass didn't really tour during their first album release with Epicus in 1986. In fact, they didn't start touring properly until 1988. In 87, they played a handful of shows in Sweden, but the following year would be when the band really started to gain a much bigger following. 1988 would see Candlemass touring with the likes of Venom, Sacred Reich, Sabbath, and even Motorhead. They would even play the once iconic Dynamo Festival in the Netherlands in the same year. This tour would help to support Candlemass's third studio album, Ancient Dreams, released in the same year. And from a commercial perspective, I think you could absolutely say that this was their breakthrough record. It would be their first charting album. It reached number 45 in the Swedish album charts and stayed in the charts for 4 weeks from November of that year, so it must have made its way into a few Swedish Christmas stockings in 1988. Not only this, Ancient Dreams would also peak at 174 on the US Billboard 200 and stayed in the American charts for 6 weeks in 1989. Candlemass had achieved something pretty incredible. They had become the only doom metal group to actually land a spot in the American charts for this time period. Ancient Dreams was literally sharing chart space with the likes of Michael Jackson, Def Leppard, Guns N' Roses, and even Van Halen, amongst a bunch of other huge pop artists of the era. Quite incredible when you think about it. To be a Swedish band and to enter Billboard, that's just fantastic. I was really blown away by the fact when I first heard it, I said, this is not real. Okay, just for a couple of weeks, but anyway, you have the attention there and you've got the proof that you did it. You were there. In Sweden, we had big articles in every Swedish paper, the biggest papers, Candlemass on Billboard. I mean, that's fantastic promotion for the band. I can't complain about it. Okay, we're not exactly Roxette. They've got 4 number 1s, and that is even better than ABBA. That's another Swedish export. So now there's Roxette, and a bit down, we've got Europe, and a bit down, there's Candlemass. Ancient Dreams will be released in the UK, US, Greece, Poland, and even Japan, and featured another artwork on the front cover from painter Thomas Cole. This time it was Cole's painting Youth that made up one of the 4 paintings in his series, The Voyage of Life. Despite the fact Candlemass were now seeing some great success with their music, building a global following, and even seeing chart success, Ancient Dreams would essentially become the beginning of the end for this great doom metal epic adventure. We have singles, EPs, live records, studio albums, compilations, and we also have concept albums. A concept album in general is an album that essentially tells a story from start to finish. Each song has a very specific purpose and meaning, and the album overall tries to portray either a real event in history, a fictional story, or outlines a philosophy or ideology. Some examples of iconic concept albums would be The Wall by Pink Floyd, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars by David Bowie, and 2112 by Canadian prog rock legends Rush. The Wall, released in 1979, follows the story of a rock star who loses himself in his ego and becomes a fascist drug addict who thinks his mortal enemies are his mum, wife, and grade school teacher. But it was always just himself. Or that's at least how Rolling Stone magazine describes it. The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, released in 1972, is basically a tale of an alien that comes to save Earth. And then 2112 by Rush. Released in 1976, according to Rush, this album is based in the future. A galaxy-wide war results in the union of all planets under the rule of the Red Star of the Solar Federation. By 2112, the world is controlled by the priests of the temples of Syrinx, who determine the content of all reading matter, songs, and pictures, every facet of life. There are literally hundreds, maybe thousands of concept albums out there, and this also includes the fourth studio record by Candlemass, Tales of Creation. Released in 1989, it would also be the last Candlemass record to feature Messiah Marcolin on vocals within this period of the group's history. Some of the songs on this record were even laid down as demos many years prior, so it had been in the works for several years. And the general concept of Tales of Creation is, you guessed it, how the world was created. This record would essentially be the start of the breakdown of the group, ultimately leading to their split in the early 90s, and it seemed to be mainly due to conflict with Messiah and the rest of the band. During the Tales of Creation album, we told him to relax the vibrato, but Messiah being Messiah, he told us to f*** off. During the Chapter 6 album, we told him again, and he told everybody to f*** off again. I don't really want to go into details, it's just the way he is. It's like a bad marriage. You have your good days with him, but there are times where there are going to be major outbursts. It's like walking on thin ice. It's not easy when a person refuses to discuss things in a band. That's a big thing for me. It's a band. And I think you should listen to our guitar player when he says something, or when I say something. That's just normal decency. Even if you don't like what people say, you should listen. Ultimately, the conflicts within Candlemass would see Messiah Marcolin leave, and the band would eventually break up after their fifth studio album, Chapter 6, released in 1992, which would actually feature a completely different singer. Regardless, during the 1980s, Candlemass released a total of 5 studio albums. The first 4 are absolutely regarded by many as the group's best work, and the most influential overall when it came to the doom metal genre. The following decade, Messiah Marcolin would form a new group called Memento Mori. During the 90s, this group would release 4 studio albums: Rhymes of Lunacy in 1993, Life, Death and Other Morbid Tales in 1994, La Danse Macabre in 1996, and Songs for the Apocalypse, Volume 4 in 1997. Just keep in mind, when you listen to these 4 records, Messiah didn't actually appear on La Danse Macabre. They had a different vocalist here. Although this was kind of classed as a new group, it was also somewhat of a continuation of the Swedish metal group Hexenhaus. However you want to class this transformation, the albums Memento Mori released were pretty epic. And I would also highly recommend checking out all 4 records from Hexenhaus as well. They released 4 studio albums from 1988 to 1997. Candlemass did of course reform in 1997, and Messiah Marcolin has rejoined and left the group again since that time, and they are now performing with the original vocalist Johan Lundqvist from Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, their debut record. Candlemass have released in total 13 studio albums since their inception, with the latest being Sweet Evil Sun in 2022. And since 2005 have consistently appeared in the Swedish and German album charts. And of course there are more stories to be told with these records, but that's for another time. The doom metal genre has continued to grow, and we've seen more modern groups such as Sleep, Acid Bath and Sun O garner some popularity, to name a few. However, I don't think anything could ever beat the initial rise of the genre and the epic era of 1980s Candlemass. I certainly hope you enjoyed this tale of creation.